Ephraim's book of the Priesthood of God from Adam to Ezra Taft Benson. I guess you'd call it a branch of Mormonism that he created because it's heavily influenced by Mormonism.
Your father forced their whole family to convert to Mormonism when the missionaries came to their door.
When he joined the Mormon church, he thought he was going to be the next prophet. And when he found out that prophets aren't selected just from the general people, that is when he started his concept of writing this book. He's got to prove that he is the prophet to help save the world.
Yeah, he essentially believed that he was the one that was going to usher in the new millennium. And after Ezra Taft Benson, it was going to be my grandpa. But he wanted to be worshipped like that. He wanted to be in charge of a religion. He did want to lead people, but his mental health just never allowed him to follow through with even trying to convert people.
My mother hand typed this entire book by herself off of handwritten notes from my dad.
On a typewriter.
On a typewriter. There's no Microsoft Word.
Oh, Lordy.
They created their own publishing company to get it published, but they found somebody who was able to bind books that large. And so she essentially gave them their original copy. They made 50 bound books out of it.
Hey, my name is Shelise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you'd like to see our faces and this enormous book that we are going to show on camera, please go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness, where you can subscribe. We're so excited to be almost at that 200,000 mark. It means so much that so many of you are willing to support us and watch our channel. So thanks for doing that. All right, so today's guests, plural, we have a daddy-daughter combo, which I believe is the first time ever. Super exciting. We found them from you guys. You actually sent one of their videos to us about a man who started his own religion. It just happens to be her grandpa, his father, and he compiled this enormous book of writings, musings. We're gonna see what's in there because I don't even know what's in there yet. It's gonna be really exciting. So we're talking about from Islam to Mormon to his own religion. There's just so much going on here, so I'm just gonna bring both of them on. Thank you so much for joining us, Sami and Adrian.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Super
excited. Couldn't be happier.
Yeah, so I was stopped in my tracks when I saw this book. So just let's hold it up for everyone to see, because it's just, they need to understand what we're dealing with here. Wow. Okay. Have you weighed it? Do you know how much it weighs?
We haven't.
Great question.
That is a good question.
Noted.
It's got to be at least 10 pounds.
Do you know how many pages it is?
Yeah, it's, I think, 2,242 pages.
Okay.
50 pages of which are the table of contents.
50 extra on top of it.
Oh,
50,
wow.
50 more pages, I guess, yeah.
So it's going to be one of those, how did we get here moments? So we have to go all the way back to, I think it's relevant to talk about his childhood, how he was raised, and how that kind of informed his thoughts, opinions, views, perspectives on the world. So I guess, Adrian, let's start with you, and feel free to jump in, Sami, if you know any other additional details.
Yeah, in order to understand what causes a man to start his own religion, consider himself the Messiah, and write a book that's over 2,000 pages, you don't get there overnight. And so I do know a lot about my dad growing up. He was raised in India. Although the family is mostly Pakistani, there is my mom called it a little mini kingdom in India around the city of Hyderabad that is Muslim, whereas the rest of India is Hindu. And so he was Muslim, his family was Muslim, living in Hyderabad, India. And he grew up there, and he was considered always a rebel in the family. He was a rebellious kid.
And he had many siblings. How many siblings?
10. There was 10 children in the family. And in order to understand my dad a little bit, I guess you probably need to understand his parents a little bit and the culture in which they were raised, being back Muslim. And there is a lot of, strict observance. In the Muslim world is not very much different than other religions. There are observers who follow it very, very strictly and people who follow it very, very loosely.
Yeah.
It was, my dad never really took to the church because he had his own ideas his whole life. And it was a very, very patriarchal society he was raised in. His father was my grandfather, very firm person. One example my mom told me about my dad's oldest brother, for swearing, the punishment was that my grandfather stuffed his mouth with hot red peppers and made him swallow them. And so that was like the type of punishments that were given. And it caused my dad, basically he cut high school for the entire term of high school. He never went. There's a test you have to take to get out of high school there that he thought he could just cram for and take. And he did that. He crammed for it, went to take it. And then they said he couldn't take it because he didn't attend. And he didn't want to tell his dad. And that was the driving force for him leaving India for America, because he didn't want to tell his dad that he didn't finish high school, because that would have been a corporal punishment type of situation there. And so we just learned that. My mom said that was the driving force for him leaving his family and coming to America.
Which he was 18.
He was 18, yeah.
Okay.
And also he was abused as a child by a religious leader. And that, unfortunately, the news is full of stories about religious leaders who do that kind of thing. And so that was a factor. You know, of course, we know hurt people hurt people. And my dad was a hurt person, and he hurt people. And I was a hurt person, and I lived my whole life with the philosophy of trying to avoid not hurting people. And I was successful in some ways, and in some ways not successful. And Sami can talk to a little bit more about the types of hurt that I either dealt out or felt myself, or was part of our family cultural environment growing up in Mormonism, raising my 4 kids in Mormonism. My dad was heavily influenced. All his family ended up moving to America. He always considered himself, and he was a genius level intelligence man. And that kind of added to sort of the trouble of growing up under the dictatorship of a genius level abuser who was so targeted in his abuse that he made sure that it hurt the worst at the worst times. And it wasn't always physical. And physical was part of it, but the mental abuse was very specifically targeted to hurt in the most. But my mom said he really and truly felt he was always doing exactly the best thing for his family. The abuse was part of, I guess, that toughening up that we needed as kids to be able to become our best selves type of a thing. And he took that to an extreme. In order to understand him, you need to understand his mother. So his father, very strong, dictator type person, heavy punishment. There was an article written about my grandmother. This is something that's show it backwards on the screen, but it just says, courageous stand, Pakistani woman fights for rights in the Middle East. My grandmother was a fairly famous women's rights advocate.
Oh, wow.
In Pakistan and in India. And the article, I'll send to you an electronic copy. It talks about a lot of her accomplishments. Her books were used in schools. She kept her maiden name in the 40s, which was like unheard of. She had her maiden name on her passport. And so even though my grandfather was a very strict man, he was always open-minded, and him and my grandmother made sure all of their children were educated. They were not poor. They were well-known. And in India, that makes a big difference as far as your quality of life. She was a forward thinker. And my dad was always a forward thinker too. Unfortunately, the forward became his own creations based on his own experiences with religions, with cultures, with different things, and with himself as the focal point or the Messiah figure in what would turn out to be, I guess you'd call it a branch of Mormonism that he created, because it's heavily influenced by Mormonism. We'll talk more about the book, but he placed himself in that position of being sort of the leader into the new millennium. Mm-hmm. I could talk for years about stories about him. One thing, just so you just get it out, what was normal to us. One time I had a paper route and I was coming back home from doing my delivering of papers, came home to my dad cursing and yelling and at the top of the porch and throwing the TV off the porch and crashing onto the ground. And I just continued walking right through that into my room. And that was considered like, completely unfazed.
A normal occurrence?
Not that itself, but things of that gravity were happening regularly in my house. And so it was like not a big deal. And so some of the things, though, like a lot of the abuses kind of dwarf that sort of a situation, throwing the TV onto the ground. And another example is he really never watched TV except for one show ever. And that was Doctor Who. And it was strange because our family, that was what we watched. Except my dad, when he watched it, he would put a Halloween mask over his face so that the government couldn't watch and know he's watching TV. He was an extreme paranoid schizophrenic.
Oh,
and so if you've seen the old movie, A Beautiful Mind, which gives I remember watching that when it first came out. I'm like, oh, wow, that's like a sort of safe my dad. And he was really crazy and had all these paranoid schizophrenic visions and stuff. And my dad had those regularly all the time. And he would always tell us about them. It led him to do things like wearing a mask in front of the TV and constantly, driving down the road, pointing at a billboard and saying the government is watching through that billboard. And also that woman on the billboard is my wife.
Oh.
To get from one place to another, you just never know what he's going to say or do.
And I do want to make it clear for everyone watching, I don't want this to come across like we're making fun of people with mental illness, because that's not what we're doing. I really wanted to see what it would be like to live with a father who thought he was the Messiah, who had these religious thoughts and beliefs, and how that affected his children, how that affected children's children, because ultimately it was like living with a cult leader. But we don't want it to feel like, hey, let's make fun of people who have mental illness, because that's not the case. And Sami, I think you did mention in one of your videos on Instagram that not all paranoid schizophrenics are violent or are this way. This was just the culmination of who your grandpa ended up being.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I did make that disclaimer in my own personal videos about it, but it's super, super important to clarify that he wasn't abusive because he was schizophrenic, and that those two things aren't inherently hand in hand at all.
Mm-hmm.
No poking fun and no silliness. I mean, all of our family has dealt with mental health problems because genetically it's in our blood. Obviously, it's just something that we've all dealt with. So yeah, not to make light of the situation at all. Definitely don't let this affect how you feel or look at people with schizophrenia in any way, shape, or form. He's an isolated case and not reflective of how everybody with that specific mental illness is, for sure.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit about sort of what me and my siblings. I have one older brother and two younger sisters. What was sort of normal for us growing up. And it was basically long, sustained abuse that has affected every single relationship I've had for my entire adult life. And I'm at right now the best place I've probably ever been in my life. Years of therapy, and also departure from my own high demand religion, Mormonism, which I took very seriously when I was in.
Well, your father forced their whole family to convert to Mormonism when the missionaries came to their door when he was 18.
Okay.
Would you like to hear a little bit more about that story of how we joined?
Yeah. So I'm putting the pieces together. So your dad met your mom in the States. They weren't practicing any religion at that point until the missionaries came by?
That's right. And
he was
when I say no religion, there was no official religion in our household. He was
spiritually driven. He always had beliefs in God and those sorts of beliefs, but it wasn't subscribed to one specific religion.
No, but it was high demand.
It wasn't a focused belief.
It was a high demand being in my dad's home with him being the religious leader.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So he felt that he was still the patriarch of the family, that he was to rule over the kids. And even though there wasn't any religious focus, he still had spiritual demands that needed to be met. Is that right?
Deep and troubling spiritual demands, yes, to say the least.
So what did that look like before Mormonism came in?
Great question. So growing up, the very early years were not as bad because his schizophrenia became more extreme later on. As time went on, he became progressively worse and worse. And as I like to tell people, Dad wasn't all bad. Good Dad was great. And it brings up a good dichotomy about being completely free and completely captive as a child. And when I say completely free, we had very few rules and regulations we had to follow as children. My brother and I were allowed to do basically anything we wanted to because my dad, being a rebel, he didn't really care about institutional rules. And so we didn't really need to follow institutional rules.
As far as like laws go and school rules go, he's always been very anti-establishment. So despite the fact that he's had a lot of his culture from what he was raised in, being a very patriarchal, high demand society, he still, I feel like his interest in the anti-establishmentarianism of everything kind of overrode that a lot of the times.
And yet he still maintained, like, he basically was an anti-establishment person who became his own establishment and did the very thing he was saying was wrong.
Yeah.
Because he became the establishment in his own home. One story, when I was 4 years old, one of my earliest memories will emphasize this point about having complete control over his family and also allowing us to do almost things that no parent would ever allow their kids to do. When I was 4, we lived in Cincinnati. That's when one of my younger sisters was born. And there was a tornado alert then. And every home has a basement there. And so we were required to be going down into the basement. So that's what our family, and this wasn't like there was like a tornado outside and get out now. My entire family did that, escape the tornado. And I'm like, I want to watch it. I want to see the tornado. And my parents said, go ahead, go watch it. We're staying down here. My entire family stayed down. And so I was allowed to go up and I watched this tornado go through probably a half a mile away behind my backyard, just going across the sky. And I remember at 4 years old being disappointed that it didn't come closer. I have always been the type, like my dad, rebellious. I was the rebel in the family. My brother was too, but I was really openly angry and rebellious. And I had a lot of good reasons in my mind to do so. So we had a real dichotomy growing up because my brother and I, especially, my brother's 14 months older than me, very close in age. He was 1 year ahead of me in high school. And it gave us an opportunity to explore the world. Mm-hmm. We lived in Los Angeles when we were young, but then moved up to a really small town in Northern California where it was all nature. And we explored the whole thing. Like, we almost never home because we hated being home.
It was a really interesting combination of being in a household that is both extremely controlling, high demand, punishment driven, and also being neglected and being able to have this freedom that kids should not be allowed to have. So you had to both be your own parent, but also allow your parents to be parents in the ways that they thought they needed to.
Yeah, and in the case of my dad, that was whatever he said, and he was always off on some tangent, always some tangent. And we had to listen to his lectures. And those were hours-long lectures, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes with all the kids, about this thing or that. And it wasn't pleasant because if we didn't do good enough, we were punished. One example, when I was, Los Angeles, this would have been second grade, right before second grade. We were homeschooled until then, until the cops caught my brother and I outside wandering downtown Los Angeles alone at ages 7 and 8. And the cops came up and took us home because we were supposed to be in school. And that's when my dad got busted. He says, I homeschool, but he really didn't have anything official. So that's when we started going to school. Anyway, that's besides the point. He was teaching us algebra, me and my brother. I was 7, my brother was 8, teaching us algebra. And I remember not understanding something, and that got me a slap in the face for not understanding algebra at 7 years old. And so these kinds of demands were put on us. Not much when I was in middle school, he went through a phase where we had to learn every type of airplane that existed. and be able to identify it by the tail fin. So if we could identify all these airplanes, you can imagine every airplane that's been created. We had to memorize and learn the differences between these airplanes by looking at the tail fin. And I still to this day have no idea why we had to do that, but those are the kinds of things that were expected of us. And if we complied, we could go and be free and do our things.
So there was really no structure as like the normal rules that you hear from high demand groups, like the no dating or not being alone with somebody or,
Right.
All of the different religious rules. They're really just completely random and you have to learn them as he comes up with them. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
And they would change frequently.
And changing frequently. And that was one of the hugest trauma, capital T traumas of my childhood, is not knowing if what I was doing was going to be good or was going to be punished.
Yeah.
And so that sort of all of us kids were forced to basically raise ourselves. But me in particular, and my siblings will agree with this, I was the one who I was always saying when I was a kid, that's not going to be me. Now I know what not to do with my kids. And so most of us never really thought about childhood, just moved on with our adult lives. But if anybody needed to remember something, they came to me because they knew I had specifically, even as a kid, told myself, I am going to remember this. I'm going to remember these things and I'm never going to forget them so that I don't do the same thing to my kids. And so I was really the one who made sure there were Christmas presents under the tree at Christmas time. I was the one who felt sort of responsible for my little sisters.
You would cook for the family.
I would cook for the family.
In elementary school.
And things like that. And I realize now, even as an adult, one of the real traumas that I carried with me was that child inside of me believes he failed to protect my sisters when they were young. And I never even realized that was a thing for me. But I realize now that has lived with me in the form of guilt and shame my entire life, of not, first of all, thinking it was my responsibility to be that person, giving myself a responsibility I could never realistically accomplish.
And also, I feel like it's probably one of the main reasons why you, of all your siblings, remained in the Mormon church after converting when you were 18 is because, as we all know, guilt and shame are very, very much utilized tools within a religion like that. So I feel like you probably felt comfortable and at home and validated in indulging in those feelings of guilt and shame because they came so natural to you already.
Yes. And looking back, it's really easy to see I went from a situation where I was raised in an extreme environment of guilt and shame and then joined a church that also provides an extreme environment of guilt and shame. Everybody's experience is different with religions. It's not a religion thing. It's how we process what we have. My experience with Mormonism is different than my wife's experience with Mormonism, because those same messages we hear, we're going to process those differently. For me, I take a lot of things seriously, and the patriarchal, I was an unwilling participant in the patriarchy, sort of. A little bit more about the environment we grew up in, my dad being paranoid schizophrenic, but it was also drugs were a big part of our home environment. And to say that we were pretty cavalier about drug use and about nudity in the home and about things like that would be an understatement. There's a picture of all of us. I think I was 8 or 9 or something like that. All of us just posing in front of a camera completely naked, from my toddler little sister to my brother who's 10 or something like that, and my parents, and we're all just smiling, looking at the camera completely naked. And I'm like, that was just normal, right?
And
normal.
Drug use was probably borderline encouraged.
No, not borderline encouraged. So, and that's the thing I do want to say about, because even in Cincinnati, when I was 4 years old, my dad would get the entire family together and we would smoke cannabis together. Cannabis has been part of my dad's religious beliefs forever. He used it, he grew it, and it was part of my childhood growing up. And that affected us differently, all of us kids. And I only learned recently about how my sister has dealt with the same trauma. Because for me, as a young, it didn't really bother me because, it was kind of nice. It didn't bother me at all. Cannabis is fine. I feel good. You're good. My sister hated it. It was traumatic for her. When she grew up, even now, she'll say any mention, thought, or anything that would include drugs being in her house gives her a visceral and physical reaction negatively. And she's terrified just the thought of drugs. And whereas me, I experimented with every drug known to man when I was in high school. And that was just what we did. And it was just part of our life. And so the same traumas, all four of us kids were realizing even just now, we process those traumas in very different ways. In some ways, passed some of those traumas on to our children as well, all of us, in different ways as well. So cannabis was there, but I remember I was 11 when my dad gave me my first cocaine.
Oh.
He had cocaine. He's like, oh, come here. Here you go. Try this.
Oh, wow.
I tell people about that. And to me, that was normal. That was my life. But when I tell people, and now I know, oh.
So hard drugs, not just cannabis. We're talking hard drugs in the home.
Hard drugs. Yeah, hard drugs.
Whoa.
So that was just part of our environment. I went with him on drug deals. When he would go buy pot, he brought me with him. We'd go to a dark park. He'd meet somebody, pick up something, and then we were gone. And so to me, I didn't know any different. I didn't know that wasn't I knew that wasn't normal, but I didn't know how abnormal.
Yeah, I have to pop in with a disclaimer because I feel like people may say, well, cannabis can be great when used properly. I want to second that. I think that there's a time and a place if that's for you. But I just want to point out that these are children and you shouldn't be doing that before you have a fully developed brain.
100% agree.
We totally agree.
With the Coke, though, I'm going to say no. That's a hard no. But
yeah, it's going to be a hard no.
Yeah. So real quick, within your family dynamic, you said that you felt guilty that you weren't able to protect your sisters. Did he treat the girls and the boys differently in the home?
Yeah, definitely. And even within the girls and within the boys, he treated us differently. So my brother Tom was the firstborn, and the firstborn in Indian culture and in that society, that's very important. So if you think about inheritances and things like that, in the old days, the firstborn would get the inheritance and that type of thing. So the firstborn is a culturally significant and high pressure position to be in Indian culture. And my brother was the firstborn, and all of us growing up, all the kids knew he had it worse. He got it worse than all of us. When there were beatings, he was beaten worse. When there was rules, they were enforced with him first. And for me, it was all the same, except it was just worse with him, And so even within us, it was different. With the daughters, my youngest sister was born when 9 years after me. So she's 9 years younger. My other sister is 4 years younger than me. The older younger sister was like the dad's favorite. And so she really didn't get beaten. We didn't really resent her for it. We were always really happy that somebody wasn't getting hurt as much, but it was her that didn't get hurt as much. And then my youngest sister, she was not the favorite. She was an accident, I think. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think she was not exactly expected. She was abused, I would say, sexually than the worst. I don't think got more than like touching and stuff like that. But it was definitely there. And both my sister has come forward with all so there's nothing secret here. Sisters come forward. My brothers come forward publicly with the extended family about what happened. And his siblings were all shocked at the levels of abuse that were in the home. Everybody knew he was a little off, a little crazy, right? I mean, he was crazy. The thing is, he was so good at presenting other personas in public and with other people that nobody knew anything was wrong. And we, as kids, were also taught to show nothing's wrong. And so we were to act as if nothing's wrong at home, act as if, and if anybody asked, Everything's fine. And we were coached into that. Like I said, my dad was a rough person, but he wasn't all bad. And even now, I don't really have, and I'm going to go ahead and give somatic therapy a shout out to allowing me to get past these feelings of anger towards my dad. I'd really like to meet him because he did have a lot of really interesting concepts. He was super, super smart. And the one thing he was completely stuck on is the concept of energy neither being created nor destroyed. And I don't know why he got so hung up on that. But it was always interesting to me, some of his thoughts that were really out there. But I'm like, you know what? He's on to something. What is it? And I agreed with him a lot of the times because a lot of his anti-institutional stuff I carry with me to this day.
Okay, so we have a really good picture of who your dad was. He's since passed, so that's why I say was, and how he treated your family. So let's talk about what happened when the missionaries showed up at your door and he was like, yes, that's the one.
Yeah, that was an interesting day because I had just graduated from high school. I was still living at home, and the missionaries knocked on our door. And my dad let him in, which for one thing, he spent his entire, he never worked. He was home all the time writing. That's all he did, writing and research. My mom worked. He was the stay-at-home dad. And it was really unfortunate because we really didn't like being at home there. And so we couldn't bring friends over. Like nobody could come over. So the fact that he let the missionaries in was shocking in itself. And then he came down. He was upstairs and I was downstairs. And he came down and said, you got to talk to these guys. And I'm like, no way. And he said, okay, talk to them or move out.
Oh.
And I'm like, fine, I'll just talk to him. I wanted to move out, but the practicalness, it wasn't practical at the time. Anyway, I went up and talked to the missionary. I really liked the guys. They were really nice guys.
As Mormon missionaries.
As Mormon missionaries always are, right?
Yeah, they're like 18 to 21 years old. So just to give everyone who's not familiar with Mormon missionaries, they're kids.
They're kids. And they taught about the Mormon church. And you know what? I liked it. And I went to church. And I liked it because it was all the things I didn't have in my own home. Kids that were happy being with their parents, families that look perfect. Nowadays, I understand what those glasses, rose-colored glasses were. We understand that in Mormonism, my experiences was it's much more important to look perfect than to be perfect. And so looks are very important. How we present ourselves to the world is very important. But in the end, it provided a structure, something I had never known in my entire life, a structure. And so for me, it was good. And I needed something because I just graduated from high school and felt, to put it mildly, hopeless. Like my life was hopeless. And in reality, there was no reason for me to feel that way based on what I had accomplished to that point. But that's a topic for a different day. But when the missionaries came over, they taught my dad and me. And that was it. My mom, she converted. They came over. And then we started getting, they brought some of the members over. And the members were fine people, just wonderful people. And that has never been my quarrel with the Mormon church as far as the people go. The people are the only hope for the Mormon church failed leadership. But then I have the two younger sisters that were, let's just say 13 and 9, something like that. And so they didn't really have a choice.
Yeah.
They're going to go. And my older brother also was made to be baptized and joined, but he never, ever even considered joining Mormonism. He didn't want to. My dad made him do it because he was also living at home too. And so we all joined, our family of 6, and the ward rejoiced having us there. For me, I thought it was great. It provided a structure I definitely needed. So for me, even though I'm not a member of the church anymore, I really realized that for a time, it was exactly what I needed in order for me to become a better father, better husband, raise my kids within a structure that wasn't as chaotic as my own childhood. It came with its own problems. That border, that structure eventually became a prison.
Yeah.
My older brother and my youngest sister left the church. And my youngest sister converted to being a Baptist. She became it was like a born again situation. It's one high demand religion to another high demand religion, basically a move sideways. And then my mom is still a member and remarried and is married a member of the church.
Interesting.
And I myself left about 5 years ago. Both my daughters left before I did. And I have 2 sons that are still in the church.
I definitely want to get to that point where we talk about how the Mormon church affected you. First, I want to continue on with your dad's storyline here. So how did your dad's persona change, if at all, when he joined the church? Because if you have all of this chaos, now it's organized chaos. So did the rules of the home change? Were you forced to then conform to all the strict Mormon rules? Did the coffee leave the house? Did the tea leave the house? Like all of those type of things.
Those are excellent questions. The answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. Basically, as soon as he joined, life with him got way better. Just way better, because he was happy. He was happy that he'd found something that he feels he can latch onto. And again, I had just graduated. My brother was already out. So we have the 2 little sisters. So we're kind of grown up already. As far as the environment in the home changing, yeah, well, all of a sudden we're starting to play games on Monday night.
Family home evening.
Family home evening, right? Every Monday night we do something together as a family. We started having home teachers coming over and visiting. Our home is a no visit zone my entire life. And all of a sudden our home teachers are people, anybody. People are coming over and they like me. They like our family. They like us. And it was nice. And so, yes, the environment changed definitely from unstructured to structured. As far as the rules go, my dad sat me down right away and we had a talk about what Mormon rules we're going to be following here. Because in the word of wisdom, no coffee, tea, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, and all those things. Yes. Now, the first thing he shows, and this is something anybody should be saying about that, it says specifically they're not by way of commandment. Not by way of forcing someone to do something, but here's our recommendations. And yet in the LDS church, it's absolutely a commandment to abstain from those things. It's not even questions. And yet the scriptures themselves say this is not by way of commandment. My dad quickly pointed that out and said, let them do what they want. For us, we're going to obey what the scripture actually says.
Interesting.
Not what some man is telling us it says.
Yeah.
And he's right on for that. Good job, Dad. Good job on that.
Well, yeah, we know that Joseph Smith didn't really follow the word of wisdom. He had his own distilleries and such. And it was just like, these are suggestions, guys. And then around Prohibition time, they're like, see, our prophet already knew, and now we're going to stick to it. And yeah, anyway, I could go on for days. But yeah. I'm curious because if he really read the Book of Mormon and he, I imagine, understood it as much as you possibly can because it's all over the place, and he's such an intelligent man, how did he make it make sense? Was he pointing out scriptures constantly? Because it seemed like from what you're saying with this religion that he created, which is kind of Mormon adjacent, that it almost went a fundamentalist route. So I would assume that he really dug into the doctrine and maybe even the early doctrines by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young.
Yeah. And actually, when we say that, let's say best how to put it, it doesn't have to make sense. When you ask how did he get it to make sense with religion, it's all about feelings and faith. It doesn't have to make sense.
And also combined with the fact that he was severely mentally ill. So
yes.
However he made it, the justifications in his head, it didn't have to make sense externally because most of his beliefs didn't make sense at all anyway. Despite the fact that he was extremely intelligent, spoke 5 languages fluently, he still had the mental illness that was just right in the middle of everything.
Right. And it's the same thing with any religion or any belief of any kind. Could be cultural, could be whatever. If it's just what you've always done, it doesn't ever have to make sense. I mean, you've just always done it. We don't ask, why am I doing this? Why do I have to say the sacrament prayer again because I got that one word wrong? Why am I doing that? And well, that's what we do, So for him, super easy to justify any old doctrine that is outdated, old, unwanted. We can discard anything we don't want, and we can keep anything we do. And every Mormon today has that same freedom. Every person today has that same freedom and exercises that freedom within their various religions and say, I want to be this level, and I'm going to take it by every word, which is a very tough place to live. Or I'm just going to sort of base it on my own lived experience and say, well, yeah, but that's not me, So I'm not going to hate gays. For example, I'm not going to hate gays. I don't understand everything. And I might agree with the church on
families being together forever,
that kind of thing. But in the end, I never hated gays. And when I left the church, I was finally free to be myself about that particular doctrine. Just love all people equally. So for him, it was really easy to take any doctrine in the church,
just pick and choose,
change it to what he wanted, ignore it completely, or accept it completely. He could do. And again, that's not a far stretch from what all of us can do. And this is a guy super smart that's been known to be able to put on a persona if he needs to.
Yeah.
And my mom told me actually one key thing is that when he joined the Mormon church, he thought he was going to be the next prophet. And when he found out that prophets aren't selected just from the general people, that is when he started his concept of writing this book.
Okay.
Because he knew he wasn't going to be the prophet under normal circumstances. So he's got to prove that he is the prophet of the new millennium. And so throughout the book, this was all done before his excommunication. He fully believed that the church was true, even though he lived it his own way. He believed the church was true. And so he wrote a book, and it has that tone. This is written, and he called Ezra Taft Benson, who is the prophet of that day, the final prophet of the Latter-day Saints and the key prophet of all dispensations, as if he's like the combined, all Jedi from the past are now part of this new Jedi. And as we know, Ezra Taft Benson he's a small player in the prophet world in the LDS Church, like looking back in history. And some of his ideas were way out there.
Yeah.
As far as how to live our lives.
So I want to get into that. It seems like you would have been able to clock the slow descent from being a Mormon to creating his own church, which I wrote the name down, the Church of Lord Messiah Jesus Christ of Millennial Day Saints. It's even more of a mouthful than the original Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So did you see this kind of happening? Or were you just, ignoring it? Oh, that's just dad. He's just doing whatever. Do you see him writing this book down? I mean, it must have taken months or even years to write the magnitude of that book.
I think it was a couple-year project. And it was published in 1992, which looking back at the time frame, I went on my mission in 1993, my Mormon mission. So this came out right before I left for my mission. I was presented a gift of the book. And so I was on my mission when things got really crazy with my dad, and my parents got divorced while I was on my mission. And so my younger sisters, they saw more of that decline into real, true sort of delusional behavior, because he came up with his own priesthoods, which I do hold to this day, by the way. I hold multiple priesthoods for the Church of Lord Messiah Jesus Christ of Millennial Day Saints. And so he a lot of his stuff takes what was there and just kind of changes a few things around, and now it's mine. Mm-hmm. Now it's his. And so what I call really the book and everything when he started his own religion type of a thing is basically a failed attempt at trying to prove that he was the Messiah of the millennium, the Messiah that would come again to help save the world.
Yeah, he essentially believed that he was the one that was going to usher in the new millennium. And after Ezra Taft Benson was like the final prophet of the dispensation or whatever. And after Ezra Taft Benson, it was going to be my grandpa. And he did explicitly want to essentially not rule the world, but he wanted to be worshipped like that. He wanted to be in charge of a religion. He did want to lead people, but his mental health just never allowed him to follow through with even trying to convert people, but that was his intention.
Yeah, and I should point out that his life was basically a series after series of failed attempts at being successful. He was, when we were in Cincinnati, that's when he held an executive job. He hadn't gone to college and got an MBA, and he was an executive for a corporation, and he was fired for that. at that job. He was fired. Nobody knows the exact reason why. It could be because of thought he was being watched because he was Pakistani, but there was also drug use involved. So we don't know if it was one way, but either way, that's when he really started becoming more paranoid at that time after he was fired from that job. And he never really held another job again, except at Taco Bell after I had graduated. But that's a story for another day also.
Oh, how interesting. I think we need to dive into this book a little bit. Can we crack it open?
Let's talk a little bit about the book.
I'm so curious what it says.
When it comes to the book, he went by Effraim, but we call it's Ephraim is the scriptural name. We call it Ephraim's book of the Priesthood of God from Adam to Ezra Taft Benson. And so, yeah, this is the huge thing that he wrote. It's basically a historical text. So it's a religious and cultural history of the world,
right?
If you would.
It's all the prophets throughout history. So the best way that I like to think about it is when Joseph Smith created the Mormon church, it's because he believed there were no true churches on the face of the earth and he needed to restore the one true church. Mm-hmm. But my grandfather kind of believed the opposite in the sense that all of the religions throughout history were true in some degree and they were all connected and all the prophets kind of like went on the backs of each other. So it's a chronological history of all the prophets from across many different religions: Islam, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Mormonism. There's all the main religions really are in here to some degree.
Yeah. So no wonder it's so long.
If I could read just a little tiny bit from the introduction, you'll get an idea of who he thinks he is.
Okay.
Maybe I can. It's so big. It's so heavy.
Oh my gosh.
It's not really practical. Not practical. You know? Okay, so there's an introduction, and so he says, Ephraim's book of the Priesthood of God is written and compiled in the spirit of revelation and prophecy for the children of our Father in heaven and for the adopted sons and daughters, the spirit children of the Savior or Messiah, the true and living God of the righteous, the God of the Jeshurun. His holy name in the English language is Lord Jesus Christ, but he is known in ancient times as various, etc., etc., etc. And he says, yea, this book is revealed to the children of the promised seed, even to all the sons of daughters of the prophets and holy men, and those who were adopted into the Lord's holy nation, who have chosen to abide in the covenants thereof. And it goes on in this sort of flowery religious language that if you grew up in the Mormon church or any...
This feels right at home.
You understand that kind of flowery language. And so he uses that language throughout the book. It's kind of extending the number of words you need to use to make a point rather than minimizing the number of words you use. And in the end, really not making a lot of points at all, other than saying, I could have said, yeah, I wrote this book to help the world. It becomes a religious thing when we say, I am writing this because I've been commanded by God to bring this to the world, to bring these truths in the spirit of meekness and humility and all these things. And he gives a little talk about short h, little h history, and goes on about that. But then the structure of the book is a scriptural sort of structure with verse and line numbers added, which, by the way, my mother hand typed this entire book by herself off of handwritten notes from my dad.
On a typewriter.
On a typewriter. There's no Microsoft Word, no insert symbol, but how she got some of these symbols and things in here is a miracle.
Wait, so
it must be God's work.
That book wasn't printed from someone digitizing it. That is the typewritten page?
Yes. These are the exact pages.
And every sibling got one?
Not only that, we have more to share on that, and that's what we're talking about right now. So I thought there were 6 copies in existence, and everybody in the family got one, but it turns out there's not, because it was confirmed through one of Sami's followers who works at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., that they have a copy there.
What?
And because it was sent there, and they have a copy.
Wait.
And it has within it, there's also this giant, huge genealogy chart, which is also a topic for another day, which it's like 3 feet by 2 feet, that talks about the prophets from Ezra Taft Benson all the way back to Adam. And it's a genealogy tree. I mean, it is.
That's something that the order does. I don't know if you're familiar with the order, which is a fundamentalist sect of Mormonism, but
Oh, yes.
they have to memorize the genealogy going from them, like their leader, all the way back to Jesus, I think. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yes, it's very complicated living under such rules, I can attest.
But we also found out not only is there just one at the Library of Congress, that my grandma thinks that they might have made up to 50 copies.
What?
That got sold to bookstores, to libraries. They never gave them to individual people. They sent them to just various institutions and
So Brigham Young University Library confirmed has a copy.
BYU Provo has one.
What were the other ones?
Also the National Library of Israel has one for some reason.
What?
So there are apparently up to 50 copies just floating around in different places.
So we don't know, but my mom said they were not individuals. They were either libraries or an institution that bought the book and have it in their collection. We do not have a record of where they are. And so there's your Where's Waldo reference to try to find where these books are. We know a few that we didn't know of weeks ago, but there you go.
Oh my gosh.
So that's a challenge for your viewers.
And they were not printed. They were typewritten.
She hand typed the first copy, and then they finally tracked down. Well, they created their own publishing company to get it published, but they found somebody who was able to bind books that large, and so she essentially gave them their original copy, and then they made 50 copies. They made 50 bound books.
So she didn't I thought she
didn't
typed every single one. I was like, how?
Let's get technical.
She just typed one.
She would still be typing now if they all were.
Yeah, she would.
Okay. Yeah. Got it.
She said that it took him about 2 years to complete it, and he would write a few pages at a time and give her a few pages at a time. So she didn't just sit down like over however long and do it all at once. Okay. It was a process over the years that he was writing it that she compiled it along with him writing it.
It was done during work hours. So she was a medical transcriptionist, and so he would give her a few pages at a time so she could fit it in with her work and then type it up. And she also typed up the underground newspaper that I did in high school, but that's a story for a different day too.
Many stories for
so
different days.
Interesting. That's so interesting. I wonder what's going through the minds of the people who received one of these in the mail. They're just like, what's this?
Well, they bought it, so they know what they got because they were told, or they asked for it. Because it's listed out on the ISBN, and it's a freaking interesting thing to look at.
It is interesting.
And so there's some copies out there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as far as we know, we don't know of anybody that's actually read it through all the way besides my grandma, who obviously typed it.
Yeah.
So none of my dad's siblings have read it. We don't know of anybody that's read it from start to finish. So we couldn't really break down all of the contents for you, but that's
not
just
yet.
kind of the general.
Wait, you did say there was a 50-page table of contents?
Yeah.
Yes.
So can we hear some of those chapter markers? I'm just curious.
Sure. Yeah. It's basically historical.
It's broken down into 7 different epics throughout history. So there's lots of different chapters, but there's 7 big sections kind of marked by the beginning and the end of certain prophetic periods or different prophets. So there's 7 different from Adam to Ezra Taft Benson.
Okay.
But for example,
Abraham and the king Abimelech of Gerar, or Expedition to India, Priesthood of Abraham, Queen Hatshepsut's Empire, or Matasaba masonry tombs replaced by the mortuary temples. They don't mean anything on them.
Can we go to
their
that
own
page? I just need to know how.
Okay, let's go to that.
This is a journey,
that
and I'm here for it.
103:18, just like the scripture reference. 103.
Yeah, it's formatted very similar to a Bible or something like that nature. 103.
But that's not just page. Is it page 103?
Yeah, it's early on in the book.
There's a lot of images. By the way, there is a ton of images in the book. Massive amounts.
Oh.
To show the areas that he's talking about and the people he's talking about. This particular one, 103:18, about masonry tombs replaced. That is large masonry or mastaba tombs and pyramids were now replaced by the mortuary temple. Mortuary chapels on the east side of the structures were used until the time of Pharaoh Ahmose, 1580 BC, but they have been gradually declining in size and popularity through the shafts and chambers under it, etc.
So, for example, this section is in the third epic, and the title of it is From Isaac to Moses. So they're kind of split up like from this prophet to this prophet. Like, let's see, the fourth epic is from Aaron to John the Baptist. The fifth one is from Jesus to Muhammad. So he has prophets throughout all sorts of different religions. But this one's, let's see, what else do we have? Jesus to Muhammad, from Pope Sibianianus to Pope Pius V, so Catholicism as well.
Yeah.
And then what's the last one? From Joseph
Smith to Ezra Taft
Benson is the last one.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. I wonder if any of it is actually factually correct or if he's just making stuff up.
I think my mom said the strong point of the book itself, it is almost 100% factually correct.
Except for his opinions.
Just his opinion stuff on things. But like historically, he's got the facts right.
What?
Unless he puts his own spin or his own words on what something means, then the facts are going to be, obviously take that with a grain of salt because I haven't read the whole thing. But my mom said that as a historical text, it's very impressive.
So as a historical text, it's actually true, but we're not like if as a historical text,
it could be.
Book of Mormon is technically true, but we know that it's not. So it's not like Book of Mormon. It's actually factually correct as far as we know.
To a degree.
To a degree, yes.
Okay.
Except for, obviously he does talk about Joseph Smith and all the things that he did. And obviously we know it's not necessarily all the truth from what Joseph Smith said. So besides him like piggybacking off of other religious prophets, maybe not so true beliefs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because, right. So some things in the Bible I think can be factually correct and some we're not able to prove or they're disproven, like that type of factually correct, like religiously factually correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. So he makes this book and it's his intention to spread it far and wide and to let everyone know, hey, this is the real truth and I am the Messiah. How did he change as a person when he finally said, like, not I have the right things that you need to know, not I'm going to be the next prophet of the Mormon church, but I am God or Jesus himself. How did that present? Do you remember that?
It presented by him being deranged and going mentally downhill very quickly towards the end.
I think after he was excommunicated from the church, that's really when, and your mom, they separated.
It's basically 1994, a couple of years after book was published, was when it really started going. They were divorced in 93, and after my parents got divorced, that was around the same time frame because that's when he basically ended up homeless in Los Angeles. That's where he died, homeless in Los Angeles. But it was clear that he was deeply, deeply conflicted inside because he really thought that he was right about this. And then when all the outside evidence is showing that you're not the Messiah, I guess you could say he took it hard. And that's when he really went down. And we have some other writings. We're trying to drum them up of his writings right before he passed away. And those writings really dictate and show his state of mind, such as more paranoid schizophrenic stuff, where you'd say the government's watching me through the light socket or things like that. And also about referring to himself in his writings as thy holy anointed one, as if he's speaking to God. He's praying to God as God's anointed one. And so there was a lot of that towards the end about him being adamant about this is I am. And to everybody else, it sounded like absolute nonsense, of course, because we've seen it before in paranoid schizophrenics who also end up homeless and who also end up thinking they're Jesus Christ and things like that.
Yeah.
Right. He did pass his mental illness on. And I myself have had schizophrenic episodes in my life. Although the paranoia never really been there, but schizophrenia, yes, I understand the disarming nature of hearing somebody else's voice in your head. It's not a very pleasant thing.
Mm.
I've dealt with serious, if not deadly, potentially deadly mental illness in my life. And in fact, as soon as 2022, as recently as 2022, I was admitted on mental health alert, suicide alert to the hospital.
Mm.
And that's a story for another day too. But actually, one of the things I learned that I have done my whole life is to make light of mental illness because I suffered so severely from it. And one of the things we do when we're severely traumatized as children, as adults, we laugh about it and we make jokes about it. And it's funny to other people. And we latch on to that because that gives us a sense of purpose for the trauma because other people like the stories. And the reality is that's a cover up and that's a Band-Aid for not dealing with them myself and taking them on head on and not laughing about it. But in the end, I'm realizing that you can laugh about it, but it has to be for the right reasons. Because some of the stories are incredibly funny and they are incredibly humorous. And I don't want to take that away from them. But I also don't want to give power to them, meaning I don't have power over my own subconscious reactions to the life I live and the things that happen to me on the outside that send me into a manic episode or a depressive episode or a suicidal episode, all of which I've had to deal with various times in my life. But to take it past that and take what I've learned from that and see the high value, and the high value sometimes can be humor. Sometimes it can be making light of it without making light of anybody.
Right. Making light of something that you've experienced is not making fun of somebody else's experience.
It's not a fun thing. I can sit and I can talk and laugh still, even now, about the abuses that we suffered as children. And at the same time, I've learned how to revisit those experiences and find the helpers that were there with me during those times, because otherwise my mind will block the whole thing out. I spent most of my adult life never thinking about my childhood. And it was a travesty because I did some amazing things as a child that I completely forgot about because I had labeled my entire childhood as miserable. And what started it was a conversation I had with my mom about 5 years ago. And I said, Mom, what was I like as a kid? I just left the church. I was trying to find out about myself. Who the heck am I? What was I like as a kid? And she said, only two things. Only two things. Number one is I was always a happy kid. And as soon as she said that, I knew she was telling the truth, and I knew I had never considered myself a happy person since then.
Wow.
And I realized I was a dang happy kid. I was always smiling. I always had a lot of friends. I was always popular in school, and I was always happy outside the home. And I had allowed that miserable time when I was home to override my childhood happiness as an adult. And the second thing she said is I handled all the abuse really well. And those two probably went hand in hand. And I know now I handled it well is because I freaking was ignoring the pain and the feelings I was supposed to be feeling back then.
Yeah.
And we do a great job as human beings to not experience the negative emotions that we want to avoid. And especially when it comes to our own childhood traumas, we do not, under any circumstances, want to go back and revisit those situations, when that is exactly the things we need to do. Go back, revisit, and rebuild those situations to like, what else was going on during that time? That's all I had to ask myself. What else was going on during that time? Helpers everywhere, friends everywhere, people who I knew and loved everywhere, except at home. It was just me dealing with my own traumas at home. And I had my siblings, I had my mom, but when it comes to dealing with mental illness, and especially those that are the result of childhood traumas, avoidance is the worst thing we can do. And it's literally the only thing we know in the long term, but it's the only thing we really know how to do. It's just really, really hard. It's a really difficult step. And I applaud the courage it takes anybody to go back and revisit those and talk to somebody about them, tell somebody about them, and look for the helpers that were there.
Yeah. What was your mom thinking through all of this? It seemed like she was going along with it to a degree.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Was she part of the abuse? Was she just not able to stand up to your dad?
Yeah. I have two distinct categories of memories from my mom. Everything up to about the age of 5, and then everything after that. Everything up to about age 5 for me, I remember my mom was a good mom. She was a great mom. She was attentive. And actually, my dad, he didn't have a lot of really big problems that other than, hey, let's smoke weed when you're 3. But besides that, like I said, good dad was good dad. Pretty good to be around, pretty fun to be around. But he steadily got worse. And there was a period there where I realized, and I think it's after my youngest sister got born, where my mom shut off. Because it was either shut off or do something about it. She couldn't do anything about it, so she chose to shut off. And so she really became a standby parent, or someone so even now to this day, I don't really have I have a good relationship with my mom, but it's not as deep as it could be if that abuse and trauma hadn't led to her being a victim as well. And let's just the reality of it, she was severely abused as well. Severely abused. So much so that I had to make decisions multiple times as a child of whether today was the day that I was going to kill my dad.
Oh my gosh.
And I decided every time, today's not the day. Like literally, I have my sister next to me and I have to make the decision, do I kill my dad and have that be the last image my young sister standing right next to me sees? And I have to make that decision because he might kill my mom right now. She might die. And that's why when at the age of 17, I did end the abuse, and I ended it by standing up to my dad. And it got to a point where he was beating the dog again. And I said, never again. It's not going to happen again. Not me, not my sisters, not my mom, not my brother. And I attacked my dad. And I got into a fist fight with my dad. Going to that, I knew the outcome could easily be he kills me or I kill him. And that's just not a decision that a 17-year-old should have to make. And so I did. And it was really interesting because, as most bullies will find out when they're those who they bully turn against them, they're really cowards. And that's the thing is he got so scared. He tried to he went right for my balls. He went right for my nuts immediately. I blocked him. I kicked him away, and he ran away. And that was the end of that. And he never hurt any of us physically again after that point.
Wow.
And so that was the turning point, at least. And you say after he joined the church, I said, oh, he got a lot better. But really, it got a lot better after that, because he knew he wasn't the physically strongest person in the house anymore, and that could change any time. And he got that taste. And so I went to the cops after that. I ran away, but ended up, we worked it out because he said the right things. He did the right things. And actually, when he died, there was really nothing wrong with our relationship, my dad and my relationship by that time necessarily. I was more interested in what the heck was going on in his crazy mind. I wanted to hear what else he was saying that was so crazy, because it became a game at that point. What else is dad going to say or write or do? And so, yeah, I don't take mental illness lightly at all. But if it seems like I do, that's just a childhood programmed reaction for me, is to pretend it's not that big of a deal. When I know I've had more experiences in the last couple of years with more deeper therapies in reliving the actual emotions I was supposed to feel. Like, I was supposed to be sickened by some of the things I saw when I was a kid, and I wasn't. And so I felt sickened. At the age in my 50s now, I can feel sickened by the things that happened as a kid and feel great about that. Feel like, yes, I've been needing to feel that way my whole life and never allowed myself to. And I'm allowing myself to. And it feels great. And I want more of that.
Dissociating is such a common thing. I've been there as well. And sometimes when you come back into your body, it can hit you like a ton of bricks. And then you have a lot of work to do of deprogramming and therapy and everything to process that onslaught of emotions that can kind of jolt you awake. I'm curious how your childhood, because I know we want to talk about this, translated into you becoming a father and how that affected you, Sami.
I'll start and I'll bring it to a point where she can take over, I think. So, like I said, Mormonism was the best thing probably that could happen to me back then. It got me off drugs. It got me straight. I went on a mission and I was able to put myself into a box voluntarily that allowed me to ignore all the trauma, to just ignore it and pretend it didn't exist. And so that allowed me to. So my brother never had natural kids because he was too afraid. He raised 2 stepdaughters beautifully, but he was too afraid to have kids on his own because he didn't want to be my dad, and I didn't want to be my dad. And even now, looking back, I realize I was my dad a lot. But in the Mormon Church, it allowed a structure to be built around each week that sort of got me in this rhythm of having and raising kids in the church. And it's great. The family influence is very strong in the church. It's a great part about it. It has a dark shadow side, but that's not what we're talking about today. It's the positive parts of having a family structure within the church that is constantly reinforced within the church, so that I could bring that to my kids week in, week out, so they didn't have to see that darker side coming out because I had no idea what to do. I also was all in when I was a Mormon. I was all in. Every word that any prophet ever said, I was going to do it. I didn't care. And so my life started to unravel a little bit when I started having my lived reality conflict with my experience in the church and what I'm supposed to be or do or feel or things like that. And specifically, I had to start asking myself some different questions about where I started to learn things. Where did I learn that when I was behaving poorly towards my children in ways I didn't expect and didn't like? So I didn't want to be my dad. I know that. And I didn't want to beat my kids. And how did I do?
Well, you never laid a hand on us, so there's that at least.
Good start.
There at least is that. There at least.
Well, I think
that.
all you can ever hope to do is better than how your parents raised you. You always are glaringly aware of the issues that your parents had when they raised you. And of course, you don't want to do the same thing to your kids. And I think as far as not being your dad in the sense of we weren't in a volatile household. I never felt unsafe at my house. I was always taken care of. My needs were met. I was never physically hurt. So in all of those ways, you definitely succeeded in not being your dad. And the ways that you maybe fell short as far as being available emotionally and as a dad in the ways that you wanted to were not because you weren't trying to. It's because, in my opinion, the fact that you were in the Mormon church for so long and had trained yourself to not address any of the issues that he had growing up, they would kind of just bubble onto the surface in ways that weren't intentional. So whenever he would get emotional or frustrated or volatile in a way, even in those moments, even if they were hard for me to deal with, I always knew that it wasn't his fault or wasn't how he wanted to react. I knew that's not how he wanted to behave. And so I'm really happy now that he has left the church and has given himself permission to start unraveling the things that he always made light about growing up that were very traumatic for him. He was able to, I think, loop back around and understand all the ways that he let those things overcome him when he didn't want to. But I feel like a lot of my own personal traumas just simply came from being raised in the Mormon church and not necessarily anything my dad ever did directly. It was more just by proxy because, like he said, he was very strict in the Mormon beliefs when he was Mormon. He upheld every single rule, and it was very strict and structured. And so I feel like the traumas that I had were from that, not because of how he was as a person. And now the fact that we've both left the church and I'm an adult, and I think we've been able to kind of work through a lot of those issues that may have presented themselves when I was a kid. But
well, the one example that's kind of started my deraveling was her and her sister. Her sister is 19 months younger than her, so they're close in age. I was starting to treat them in ways that I didn't like because of my reactions to what I was taught in the church. So was it in the car, was it coffee or was it swearing or something like that?
Well, what? Yeah. So just an anecdote. I always had to be sneaky. Of course, we all know that strict parents raise sneaky kids, not obedient ones. So I would often be doing pretty much everything that I did behind their back. And so I had a secret Twitter account, and I tweeted that I liked coffee or that I had gotten a coffee. And this was when I was in high school, maybe like 15 or 16 or something like that. I didn't know my parents had found my Twitter, but they had somehow. And I was over at one of my friends' houses, and my dad comes over to my friend's house, and he's like, "Oh, hey, Sami, I have a surprise for you. Like, come out to the car." I was like, "Oh my God, what is it?" So I come out, and he had a coffee, and he just absolutely tore into me about how horrible I was, and how just really, really mean. And I was devastated. I was sobbing. I was like, "I'm so sorry." And I had to go back into my friend's house, and of course they're like, "What's the surprise?" And I was like, "Oh, nothing."
A surprise punishment.
Surprise punishment. So it was things like that were the most traumatizing things, just essentially breaking the Mormon rules and receiving whatever emotional punishment. And I'm the oldest child, so I most definitely, as a lot of oldest children do, got the massive brunt of all the rules and all the punishments. And while I'm glad my siblings had very different parents than I did, it is, you kind of get to a point where you're like, I wish I had the version of my parents that my youngest brother does. But yeah, it's just a lot of that flavor of thing. Again, nothing ever physical, nothing quote abusive, but just a lot of of emotional.
It is abusive, and it was abusive because I was taught by the church to react that way when my children didn't do things that were in line with what the church was teaching. And coffee, it's a great example because it's so harmless that
so benign.
The world. It's so benign. It's so benign. And yet I made that a really big stinker in our relationship, as if she had disappointed me worse than, of course, in the Mormon church, murder is equated to sex before marriage.
Yeah.
So you can see like the level. And so, but what it really did is it got me asking different questions. And the one question I asked myself that I couldn't answer is, I'm like, I don't like the way I just treated my daughter. I don't like that. Why did I do that? Because it hurt our relationship, right? It hurt our relationship. And like, that's the church. The church taught me that and then I started reading old conference talks about word of wisdom and stuff. I'm like, even though you should be disappointed if your children do XYZ, you should love them. But like, wait, you just told me I should be disappointed in my child. So everybody's going to hear, you should be disappointed in your child. And I took it to heart. I was sure disappointed. And afterwards, I was disappointed in myself. And so that just got me asking, well, okay. And then I conducted a social experiment on myself. And this is what, after treating the girls, and her sister got it too, actually, for coffee. I'm like, I don't want to be that kind of parent. I love my kids. I want a good relationship with my kids. I also knew the church had taught me, and I observed, to not hang out with a lot of people who didn't follow my religion. For example, swearing. People who swore a lot, I avoided them. I was taught specifically to do that. We can find direct quotes from church leaders that say, don't hang out with them. So I didn't. And I'm like, what if I just started? I had a couple people in mind. I thought they were kind of cool, but they swore a lot. I'm like, what if I just started hanging out with them? I'm just going to start hanging out with these people. I see them at events and meetings and stuff. And I did. And I immediately started having some of the most deep, meaningful, spiritual, like mind-blowing conversations with human beings that I've ever had in my life. And I'm like, wait a second, the church literally taught me not to hang out with these amazing, beautiful people. And I have done that to my own detriment for the last 30 years of my life. I grew up having massive amounts of friends. Like I had friends all over, everybody, friends. As an adult, very few deep relationships. My relationship in the church were fleeting. They were passing and they were shallow.
Yeah.
Some of them are deeper friendships based on something other than church. But when it's only based on church, that's all you're going to get. For me, that's my experience with the church. Like I said, somebody else will hear the same talk given by somebody else that tells me I should be disappointed in my kids, and they'll hear you should be loving your kids.
Yeah.
But love, that's a loaded word.
I think that's a really important distinction. So I'm glad that you said that, because a lot of people, especially if they do follow the LDS church, some people will say, well, that's not how I was taught, or I didn't react to my kids the same way you did, and the church never teaches violence or like yelling or whatever. But I think it's important that you said everyone is going to accept the doctrine in a different way, especially if you go way back to the founders, right? I mean, we have Brigham Young telling people to go slit someone's throat if they're not doing what they should be doing. And obviously people don't do that today. So I think there are varying levels of how people choose to internalize their doctrine and essentially act in that way toward other people. And I think from an outsider's perspective, it seems like you took some of the things that the LDS church told you to do in combination, in tandem with how your father maybe would have handled the situation, and it kind of merged in this way that you didn't like and that ultimately wasn't the best for you and your family. So that's really interesting that when you left the church, you completely softened and became a different person. Would you say that that's true?
Would you say that that's true?
I
would say that is true.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm really grateful because I was the first in my immediate family to leave the church. I kind of started when it was really hard. I think I started when I was like 16, 17. It wasn't until I was about 20 that I was like fully detached. So it's been well over a decade that I haven't been a member of the church.
Yeah.
But after my dad left the church, maybe 5 years ago, something like that, our relationship has grown so much more because you are allowed to have a level of authenticity with yourself that you just are not able to access when you're Mormon, because like we talked about, you want to have this appearance of perfection to the people around you. So to do that, you don't even dive deep in your own brain and heart to know what's in there, because you kind of don't really want to know if it's going to affect how you appear to the people in the church. So I'm just a level of authenticity that I've been able to grow with him and my younger sister, who has also left the church. But I'm also extremely grateful because my mom and my two younger brothers are still members. And so we have gotten to a point in our relationship where we're all very close to each other. I'm really grateful that my mom and my brothers have chosen to continue to facilitate relationships with us, because as we know, it's very commonplace for relationships to be severed or disownments or people to cut off contact once family members leave the church. So it was really hard the first few years especially when I was still living at home when I first started to leave the church. But now I feel like we've kind of reached a really healthy homeostasis of respecting each other's beliefs, because, at first there's kind of this pendulum swing where my dad experienced it, I experienced it, my sister experiences it. When you first leave the church, you have all these angry and bitter emotions that you're dealing with, feeling like a lot of your life has been maybe taken from you in a way, or you've not been allowed to grow. And it's easy to have these really strong feelings of resentment.
Yeah.
And while those things might be true, I think my dad's also done a really good job highlighting the ways that the church was a positive experience for him and the way that it did help him in the times that he needed that help. So we've come to respect the fact that half of our family has still chosen to remain in the church, and they've come to accept the fact that we will never be members again. And I don't think at this point now it affects how deep our relationships are with each other. Of course, we all probably secretly hope that the rest of them will come to whichever side that they're on.
We're not really that secret about it. We're always telling them you should leave.
I know, but it's in a lighthearted way at this point. Yeah. They're not offended by it, and we're not offended by it.
I have a son on a mission right now.
Yeah, my youngest brother is on a mission.
York, and another son in college in Florida. And they're both very active. And my wife is active, considers herself a nuanced believer in the church. So she's not hardcore,
Nowhere near as strict as she was when I was a child and growing up. She's evolved a lot. And my brothers, I feel like they've all evolved a lot in how they are interpreting the scripture in the church in a way that's a lot less black and white and a lot more gray, which I feel like that's just a healthy way to approach nearly anything. So
yeah,
it's been good.
Well, you guys are a great example of having a mixed faith marriage or a mixed faith family in a way that can be respectful on both sides, because like you said, that's not always the case. So that's great that our viewers have an example of a case where it can work, and where maybe your family members who are still involved aren't feeling the heavy, high demand version that you guys both felt, but in a way that works for them and allows them to have their own freedom of thought and choice and decision making. So that's awesome. I feel like we're almost out of time. I think to close it up, to close the chapter on this 2,000-page book, just tell us what happened to Grandpa, to your dad, Adrian.
What happened at the end, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got back from my mission and got married almost right away after the mission. I was an older missionary. I was 24. Normally they're 18 to 20, but I was 24 when I went on a mission because I was a convert. So I was a more, they called me Grandpa out there. Anyway, when I got back though, my parents had already divorced. So that was my first experience with like going home to only mom there. And I really didn't see my dad that much sometimes, but each time it was just worse and worse as far as his mental state and his capacity to really do the things he used to as far as functioning as a human were starting to become less and less. And he died. In fact, they did an autopsy. He died of a brain aneurysm, age of 59, in Los Angeles as a homeless person. And I got to visit. Sami is the only one of our children who has ever seen him. And she was just a baby, like a few months old, maybe. And she got to meet him, and he got to meet her, I guess, when he was living in this apartment. But it was clear that he had gone very, very far downhill since then and didn't have a lot of mental capacity left. It was he was entirely absorbed in his little world, his world he had created, which the book, this was all in his head, right? I mean, this is all in his head, and he'd done something with it and with himself that nobody else wanted to be around. And so he found himself alone and miserable and homeless, and he died that way. And I won't say he deserved it. Nobody really deserves that kind of thing. And I see good versus evil differently now than I did when I was in the church. And I see right versus wrong. And I see the value of suffering differently than I did when I was in the church. So a lot of things I went through as a kid, I don't want to go back and change necessarily. I want to go back and understand and get the value from learning from those things I went through. And I think I have to some degree done that. But my father is a good example of what happens when you set the stage for yourself at a level that ultimately is never going to happen. I heard on a TV show that I agreed with, the fragility of genius is that it needs an audience. And I see my dad as a person who his entire life needed an audience and never got one. Always wanted one. When we were in Los Angeles, he wanted to be a singer. He trained to be a singer, an actor. He wanted to do those things. He got an agent, and they never went anywhere. And he was clearly, visibly, each time something got built up and didn't happen, clearly devastated each time and moved on to something else. And so that turned into his theory of anything bad happens, that's because of your own dirty living. That's a that's a little buzzword we have in our own family. Anything ever goes bad, well, you're dirty living. And that's what my dad, but he did it seriously. We just joke about it. But that goes back to thinking I'm doing something wrong if things aren't going my way. That was his philosophy. If things aren't going my way, I must be doing something wrong. And the reality is, if things aren't going your way, keep doing it, because mistakes are the way to success. My dad never understood that. Mistakes are the way to success. For him, mistakes means I need to stop doing that. So I've taken those things that I think that he really failed in teaching us the value of perseverance, because he just didn't have any. He wanted an audience. He wanted it now. He never got it. He just got worse and worse. So.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing both of your stories and your father's story / grandfather's story. It's so interesting. I want to read some of that book. Maybe we'll do a live and we'll just read the book for everybody.
She'll be doing some lives, multiple.
I think I'm going to be planning on doing some longer form videos where I do read through it.
I have a very exciting announcement about the holy text that my schizophrenic grandfather wrote for the religion that he created. And that is that I will be doing a long form series on my YouTube channel where I read through the entire book. It's going to be a humongous undertaking. I'm a little bit nervous for it, but hopefully you all stay with me throughout this journey to get into the meat and potatoes of this thing. I don't have any date for when I'll have the first episode out yet, but you can go to my YouTube page and subscribe there, just Mild West Sami. So whenever I do post it, you'll be the first to know. I'm also excited to share that my dad was able to track down some more writings for my grandpa from later in his life, which include a set of 15 commandments that he wrote. So it's a really good baseline for the tenets that he believed in. So I'm really excited to share that with you all. I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the interest and the love and support that I've gotten. It means a lot to my family to be able to share this with everybody and have it be received so well. But yeah, I cannot wait to undertake this thing and we can learn alongside each other. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you all.
Because people are clearly interested. I'm interested. I've never read it. So hopefully if you keep an eye out on my pages, I'll start to be posting some more deep dives into what it actually was saying.
Yeah. And your Instagram is at mild_west_Sami. And yeah, so guys, if you want to reach out to her, you can do that. Do you have any other final thoughts? Whoa, we need our Linda Listen moment. What's your saucy statement or inspiration?
Yeah. That's one of my favorite videos, by the way.
I love that you know it.
All right. Listen, if you want to be able to overcome some real serious childhood traumas, that has been my path. And life is never hopeless. It can feel hopeless, but it's going back and re-examining that past, giving it a different light. That helped me to overcome so many of those challenges, to be a decent parent, at least, and not hurt my children physically, at least. And there's no way I could have done that. And in fact, without both of my daughters' help. They helped me get out of the church and find my best self, that direction. And I'm grateful for that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Sami?
I would just say, Linda, listen, it's okay to grow. It's okay to change.
Yes.
Just keep it short and sweet.
Yeah.
I'm constantly having to remind myself of that.
Yeah, that's such a good one. And it's so important, especially when leaving high control groups. It's okay to deconstruct and reconstruct and deconstruct and reconstruct. And it's okay to change. Do what works best for you and for those around you. Wow, it's been so nice seeing your dynamic, and you're clearly close, and it's very inspirational. I'm sure you're going to inspire many, your relationship and how you, Adrian, were willing to change and grow and expand for your kids and to have them have a better life than you did. It's really great to see that. So do you guys have any final thoughts before we go?
I just really appreciate you taking the time, sitting down and let's talk your ear off for a minute.
I do too. And I just got introduced to your channel too. And I've gone down the rabbit hole. So
I've been a fan for a really long time.
Both my daughters are very familiar with your channel. Yeah.
Oh, how funny. So when I reached out, you're like, wait a second, I know this person.
I was like, I know her.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh, that's awesome. Well, welcome to Wonderland. The rabbit hole goes very deep.
It goes deep. Mm-hmm. It never ends.
You've got some content to binge, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys for coming on and sharing. I'm sure we'll do more videos. Maybe we could do a live or something. And so, guys, if you guys have questions, those who are watching, leave them in the comments and we'll try and answer them if we decide to go live together. And leave the comments anyway, even if you don't have questions, because it's fun for us to read. It helps the algorithm, it helps our guests. Remember, they do read the comments, they're real people. So leave those words of encouragement. And if you'd like to become a patron, you can do so at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. Our newest patrons, I hope I pronounced this right, Deidre or Daedra. Thank you so much. And Matt as well. And you can get some merch at cults2consciousness.com under the merch tab. We are sold out of our Costa Rica trip, but you can be waitlisted just in case anyone drops off last minute. If you like this video, I will leave 2 more down here below. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.